Chapter 3. If Scarsdale was, as Sterling Nelson had promised, an isolated pocket of prosperity, the town of Riverside, only a few miles away in the Hudson Valley, was an isolated pocket of grandeur. It was like no place Alice had ever seen before, and she knew at once that she wanted to live there. It would change her life. It wasn't really a town at all, or even a village, but a colony of handsome dwellings built as close as possible to the high-walled borders of a great private estate called Boxwood. Both the estate and its careful environs were the work of a self-made Wall Street tycoon named Walter J. Vandermeer, a man whose eagerness to erase his own beginnings on a small Missouri farm had made him seek to establish a new dynasty here, among the ghosts of the colonial Dutch whom he believed, on slender evidence, to have been his ancestors. He had spared nothing in creating Riverside. He had equipped it with two tasteful churches, Episcopal and Presbyterian. He made certain that its Riverside Country Club would have the finest golf course in Westchester County, and had taken considerable pains over the founding of Riverside Country Day School, on the high marble panel of whose main hall were engraved the words, "Manners maketh man." But the full flowering of his zeal had gone into the creation of Boxwood. Its grounds were a marvel of professional landscaping, in that every vista was pleasing to the eye. Wide rolling lawns, tall trees, rich hedges, and deep gardens. In addition to a number of servants' quarters and guest cottages, there were 4 substantial homes intended for the families of his 4 sons. And all the winding roads and pathways led eventually to the high ground on which he'd built his own mansion, which might have been named Boxwood Manor if it hadn't always been called the Big House. All the tall western windows of the Big House, and the marble-flagged esplanade beneath them, commanded a majestic view of the Hudson, a view only partially blemished by another and more famous big house less than 2 miles upriver, and which more than a few of Walter J. Vandermeer's early business associates had spent their final days. The squat, ugly structure of Sing Sing Penitentiary. Vandermeer had died of old age and bewilderment soon after the crash, but enough of his millions remained to ensure a long and sound survival for his aristocratic widow, his progeny, his Boxwood, and his Riverside. "Isn't it something?" Maud Larkin inquired, moving through the summer breeze of the esplanade with the proud and stately tread of a pathfinder. And Alice had to agree, in something close to reverence, that it certainly was. They paused to rest against the balustrade, and Maud Larkin said, "See, those are the Palisades. That big one's High Tor, the one Max Anderson wrote the play about. And look here." She called Alice's attention back from the mountains and away from the intermediate hulk of Sing Sing. She was pointing to the balustrade on which their forearms rested. "All this marble was imported from Italy, piece by piece. Can you imagine what that must have cost? And you see, he never did quite finish it. He built this whole beautiful place all through the 20s, and the esplanade was meant to be the crowning glory. But you see, it was supposed to go all the way across the lawn, all the way to the poplars over there. And you see what happened instead?" She took Alice by the hand and led her out to where the esplanade came to an abrupt amputation. And with a theatrical flourish, she pointed to 5 Italian marble columns lying corpse-like in the grass. 1929, she said in a stage whisper. "Isn't that something? I mean, really, Alice, isn't that something?" In the long, lonely time since Sterling Nelson's desertion, almost 3 years now, Alice had found a small measure of comfort in spending 2 afternoons a week as a teacher of sculpture in the Arts and Crafts Guild, a community enterprise that occupied the basement of the Westchester County Center in White Plains. The money she earned from it was scarcely worth counting. Most of the other teachers were volunteers, but she thought the experience would be valuable, and she hoped it might be a way of meeting people. It was. All her students were women of her own age or older, prosperously married and vaguely dissatisfied and looking for something. As more than a few of them put it, and they tended to make a pet of her. They would take her into their homes in Scarsdale or in other nearby towns just like it to meet their polite if baffled husbands. But more often than not, those evenings would end with her riding home in the embarrassing silence of the husband's cars, her mouth dry and swollen from too much talking about art and form and Paris and Greenwich Village. And when would she ever learn not to monopolize a whole evening's conversation, while the husband shifted gears and groped for pleasantries about how interesting it had been? Then, toward the end of the third year, Maud Larkin had enrolled in her class, and she knew from the start that Maud Larkin was going to be different. Not only did she seem more talented than the others, or at least more responsive to criticism, but everything else about her suggested the kind of person Alice really did want to know, and to have for a friend. One day, Maud shyly asked her out for a drink after class, and they sat for hours in a White Plains cocktail lounge. For once, it wasn't Alice who did most of the talking. And all the things Maud said revealed more and more clearly that Alice hadn't been wrong about her. Maud Larkin was interesting. She didn't live in Scarsdale or in any of its stifling vicinities. She lived in Riverside, of which Alice had never heard. And her husband wasn't an insurance man or a lawyer or a business executive like the others, but a writer. He wrote scripts for 3 of the evening radio serials to which Alice had long been addicted. "You mean you really like them?" Maud asked, her eyes as bright and as happy as her eyes as bright as a happy child's. "Oh, I can't wait to tell Jim that. He hates them. He'll be absolutely delighted." Her witty, knowledgeable talk went on through round after round of relaxing Manhattans for which she insisted on paying. Alice had to excuse herself twice to telephone Bobby with promises to be home soon. And when Maud drove her back to Scarsdale, at last, they lingered in the parked car for an exchange of affectionate declarations. "Oh, it's been so nice, Maud. Please come in and have dinner with us." "Dear, I'd love to, but I've got to get home or Jim and the kids will kill me." "But listen, I'm not letting you out of this car until you promise me one thing. Do promise to come see us soon. Bring your little boy and spend the weekend. Next weekend." "Well, I'd love to, Ma, but really, I promise. You've got to promise. I'll come and get you, all right? I'll call you tomorrow. And another thing, Alice. I know this may sound drunk and foolish, but there's one other thing I must say before I let you go. I simply can't tell you how much this sculpture class has meant to me. Honestly. I feel it's what I've always... Well, I just feel you've opened up a whole new world for me, and I want to thank you. That's all." And now in return, by bringing her to Riverside and guiding her through the splendors of Boxwood, it seemed that Maud was opening up a whole new world for Alice. "Are you sure it's all right for us to be here, Maud?" she asked when they left the esplanade and started back down one of the winding paths. "Of course it's all right. The old lady and I are on first-name terms. Well," and here she laughed in the candid little self-effacing way that was one of her most winning traits. "I guess that's not exactly true. She calls me Maud, and I call her Mrs. Vandermeer. I don't think anyone in the whole world uses her first name. Anyway, she seems to approve of me, and I know she'd approve of you. The only one you ever have to worry about is Walter Jr., the oldest son. He can be nice sometimes, but he's essentially a pompous ass. Jim calls him a capitalist piglet, says he isn't big enough to be a capitalist pig. He's the what-do-you-call-it of the whole business, you see. The executor? Is that what you call it? I don't know. Anyway, he's the man in charge, and he takes it all very seriously. But look, here's what I've been dying to show you. Come along." And Alice followed her in pleased bewilderment. They were heading around toward the rear of one of the splendid houses Maud had pointed out earlier in the tour, the one built for Howard Vandermeer, the second son, which had been vacant since the Howard Vandermeer's divorce some years before. and Maud walked boldly up to one of the rear doors and opened it. "Just wait till you see this," she said. "You mean you're going inside? Do you really think we—" "Not the house itself, that's all locked up, just the basement. Come along." Even the basement looked rich. Clean concrete corridors, along whose walls were piled the incidental refuse of the broken family. Expensive wardrobe trunks, racked pairs of skis, cardboard boxes bearing the trade names of Bergdorf Goodman, Brooks Brothers, Abercrombie and Fitch. But Alice scarcely had time to notice these things before Maud drew her over to a door that couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall. "You'll have to duck going in," she said, "but just wait till you see what's inside." The tiny door led them into an enormous, absolutely bare white room that was flooded with daylight. Its walls were of lacquered white wood, flecked all over with hundreds of little gray-black smudges, as if they'd been daubed with licorice. And they were windowless. All the light came from the high ceiling, which was made wholly of wired glass. "What is it?" Alice whispered. "It's a squash court. Howard was crazy about squash, you see. So his daddy built this whole gigantic thing right into the house. That's the kind of money they had. But Alice, don't you see what I'm driving at? Look at the lighting. Look at the walls. Don't you see what it could be?" Her eyes were gleaming. "A sculpture studio. Your studio. You could hold private classes here. My God, you'd have room for 3 times as many students as you have now and still have plenty of room for your own work. Wouldn't it be priceless?" It would indeed. Alice was instantly able to picture herself at work here, teaching people as congenial as Maud, doing sculpture of her own that would be better than anything she'd dreamed of in the past. "Well, but how could I ever—" "Wait." And Maud placed a rigid forefinger against her lips. "Don't say another word. I just wanted you to see this place. And now there's one more place I want you to see, and then we'll go home and have a drink. I told you I was full of plans, didn't I? Come on." "If you're going to work here, you'll have to live here," she said. "And I've got just the right house picked out for you, the perfect home for the artist in residence." It turned out to be an elegant little house of white stucco, attractively set in the extreme northeast corner of the estate, surrounded by trees and beds of rhododendron, with a flagstone path leading up to its front door. "They call it the gatehouse," Maud explained. "It was built for one of Mrs. Vandermeer's relatives, but it's never been occupied. Actually, it's still unfinished, but I happen to know Walter Jr. has been planning to fix it up and rent it this year. And why shouldn't it be yours?" It was locked, but they could see the whole of its interior by moving around and peering through windows. A big central room with a spectacular fireplace, a kitchen and dining area, 2 ample bedrooms with a connecting bathroom in the rear. "Can't you just see it?" Maud demanded. "Wouldn't it be the absolutely perfect home for you and Bobby?" By the time they had let themselves out through one of the heavy iron gates and strolled back to the Larkins' home that afternoon to have a drink and talk it over with Jim, Alice was completely enthralled with Maud's plan. It had become her own plan, as firm and settled as any decision she had ever made. She and Bobby would live in the gatehouse. Bobby would attend Riverside Country Day. They would be among stimulating people like the Larkins, instead of the stuffy mediocrities of Scarsdale. And the whole charming new life would be made possible by her role as artist in residence. She would have a generous new income from teaching private classes in the squash court, and if that didn't wholly solve the financial side of things, she might well find other sources. She could sell some of her old garden sculpture, even possibly sell some of it to the Vandermeers. And once she was established in this brisk new environment, there was no reason why she couldn't turn out enough new work to warrant a profitable New York exhibition once a year. Anything seemed possible in Riverside. Jim Larkin was a little doubtful. "Well, I don't know, Alice," he said. I wouldn't want to see you get involved in more than you can handle." But she'll be able to handle it, Jim, said Maud. That's the whole point. She's an exceptional woman. She's an artist of the first rank. She's an inspiring teacher, and she's been hiding her talents under a bushel long enough. This place was made for her. She's going to thrive here. I certainly don't mean to question any of that, he said, but before you girls get carried away, there's one or two practical points you ought to consider. And Alice was willing to hear him out. Jim Larkin had frightened her a little the evening before by saying he was a communist, but he wasn't at all like the communist she'd known in New York. He was quick and funny and brusque in a nice way. He seemed embarrassed to be making so much money out of radio, but he wasn't boringly apologetic about it. And he was clearly a man of intellectual substance. Hundreds of books had overflowed the shelves of his study to be strewn in attractive disorder around the living room. He knew Maxwell and Anderson well enough to call him Max, and once he had even hinted at knowing Thomas Wolfe well enough to call him Tom. Alice guessed she liked him very much, enough to be patient while he went over the one or two points they ought to consider. In the first place, he said, how do you know old Walter Jr. won't take a dim view of having sculpture classes in the squash court? Oh, where's your imagination, Jim? Maud said. We won't deal with Walter Jr. We'll go directly to the old lady, and I know she'll approve it. I know she'll love Alice. That's a foregone conclusion. And I know she's dying for some way to express herself besides writing out all those checks to hospitals. I'll just bet the idea of being a patroness of the arts is going to knock her for a loop. And Jim chuckled. Well, you may be right about that. Knock her for a loop. All for art. Art for art's sake. Maybe she'll be a pushover. God knows if anybody can talk her into it, you can. But still, even assuming that part's okay, won't it be a little hard for Alice to swing the rest of it? You can be sure they're going to ask a nice little rent for that house, for one thing, not to mention the tuition at Riverside Country Day. This is a pretty expensive town for a woman with a limited income. Her income won't be limited for long, Maud assured him. And anyway, we don't know how much rent they'll ask. They might make it reasonable for her. As for Country Day, you know perfectly well half the children go there on scholarships. And she explained this point to Alice. That's the way most of these smaller private schools operate, you see. They've got heavy endowments, but in order to justify their existence, they've got to keep their enrollments up to a certain minimum. The result is that an awful lot of kids go free. Ours don't, but that's because Jim makes so much money. I should certainly think Bobby might qualify for a scholarship. Somebody ought to tell you it's a pretty silly little school, though, Jim said, and Maud turned on him. It is not, Jim. It's a fine school. Oh, come off it, sweetheart. What the hell's fine about Riverside Country Day? You mean it's fine because our kids get to mix it up with the landed gentry? It's a ridiculous school. Don't listen to him, Alice. Please don't listen to him when he gets like this. Gets like what? He demanded. It is a ridiculous school. Everybody knows that. Jim, darling, will you please keep your voice down before the children hear you? And she turned to Alice in urgent appeal. Alice, all I can tell you is that our children love it. But by this time, Jim Larkin was laughing, tussling his wife's hair, proving that it hadn't been a quarrel at all, or even an argument, but only another surprising facet of this remarkable family, another aspect of the wonderfully free and easy way these people lived. Sure they love it, he was saying. Sure they love it. That doesn't mean they're not smart enough to know it's ridiculous, does it? Whoever said you can't love ridiculous things? God knows I love you, and you're the most ridiculous woman I ever met. The Larkin children, a boy and a girl in their middle teens, had puzzled Alice the evening before, because they seemed so aloof and unmindful of the rudiments of courtesy. They hadn't been openly rude to her or to Bobby. It was just that they'd seemed withdrawn into some private, unsmiling social pattern of their own. Their demeanor was loose and slumbrous, and they were dressed like workmen in sloppy flannel shirts and blue denim trousers, which had made Alice wonder if, to their expressionless eyes, her own and Bobby's clothes might look too careful, too neat and middle class. But now in the second evening she felt she was beginning to understand them, just as she'd begun to understand Jim. At dinner they teased their father and joined him in teasing their mother, all in a kind of affectionate wit that was precocious without being offensive. And afterwards, with no trace of showing off, they performed an impromptu musicale. Jim started it, slouching over to the piano and hammering out some quick, frivolous popular song by way of introduction. Then the girl produced a guitar and the boy a clarinet, and they played and sang delightfully for more than an hour. They were gifted children. They were interesting children. They were children quite capable of loving their school and finding it ridiculous at the same time. They were, she decided, children of exactly the kind she had always wanted Bobby to be. "Oh, Maud," she said, riding back to Scarsdale much later that night, "I can't tell you how much we've enjoyed it. It's just been the nicest weekend we've had in years and years." "Then it's all settled, isn't it?" Maud said. "I'll speak to Mrs. Vandermeer tomorrow, or I guess I better not promise tomorrow. Getting into the big house is like getting an audience with the Pope or something. But anyway, I'll speak to her this week and try to fix it for you to meet her next weekend. She'll probably invite us both for tea and you can take it from there. I just know it's all going to work out." And it did. "Will you have cream or lemon?" Mrs. Walter J. Vandermeer inquired the following Saturday in what was, beyond question, the most magnificent room Alice had ever seen. "Lemon, please." Alice felt a drop of sweat creep out of her armpit and slide down her ribs, and at the same moment she saw that the long ash of her cigarette had fallen into her lap. Would crossing her legs hide it, or would it be better to hide it with her napkin? In either case, how could she hide it when the time came to stand up? "Thank you," she said, accepting the hot, delicate cup and saucer from Mrs. Vandermeer and trying to keep them from chattering in her hands. And without Maud's comforting presence beside her, she was sure she would have fumbled and spilled everything on the floor. Maud had carried most of the conversation so far, sparing her from any direct involvement. But now all the talk had stopped, and she looked up to find herself under the full weight of the old lady's scrutiny. Tall and thin, and remarkably erect in her chair beside the tea service, Mrs. Vandermeer seemed to speak from a great distance. "Maud tells me you're a very courageous woman, Mrs. Prentice." And how in the world could she reply to that? "Well," she said, "that's very kind of Maud." And it seemed, from Mrs. Vandermeer's small, qualified smile, that she'd passed the first test. But she didn't want to risk a sidelong glance at Maud for fear that Maud might wink at her, or raise and shake her clasped hands over her head like a victorious prize-fighter. "Please excuse me," Mrs. Vandermeer said. "I'm afraid I've forgotten to give you an ashtray. Could you hand her that one, Maud, from the table?" There was nowhere to put the ashtray but in her lap, which was already filled with a trembling cup and saucer. After a little agony of hesitation, she set it on the carpet and stubbed out her cigarette in it. And then she was touched with terror. Had anyone ever put an ashtray on the floor in the Vandermeer house before? Mrs. Vandermeer's gaze had indeed followed the passage of the ashtray to the floor, and now was fixed on it with a little frown. But it turned out to be only a frown of concentration on the difficulty of forming her next sentence. "It's always seemed to me," she said at last, "that it must require a great deal of courage to be an artist, if only because the creative process is such a lonely one. I should imagine it must be all the more difficult for a woman." And Alice let the tension of her spine and shoulders subside a little into the upholstery. She had known from the start that Mrs. Vandermeer was imposing, that she was stately and beautiful, that she was an embodiment of every admirable connotation of the word aristocratic. Now, for the first time, and with enormous relief, she began to believe that Mrs. Vandermeer was nice. "Tell me, Mrs. Prentice, do you think you might enjoy working here and living here?" "Yes, I believe I would," she said. "I believe I'd enjoy it very much." "I'll be speaking to my son in the morning," she said. "I'm sure something can be arranged." "Oh, you are marvelous," Maud Larkin said when they were alone and free of the big house at last. You couldn't have been better. I know she fell in love with you. Mrs. Vandermeer apparently did speak to her son in the morning, and her son apparently didn't find the plan bizarre. An interview with him took place that same week in his office, again with Maud coming along for moral support. And though Alice found him not very likable, a plump and small-eyed, high-voiced man who seemed to have inherited none of his mother's qualities, it was clear that she had, as Maud put it, passed muster with him as well. There were two more people for her to pass muster with, a Mr. Frank Garrett, the real estate agent, and a Dr. Eugene Poole, who was the principal of Riverside Country Day. And neither of them, according to Maud, presented any obstacle. Treat Garrett like an employee, Maud advised her. After all, that's all he is. He's just a little Yonkers Mick who knows damn well he's lucky to be making a living at all. He'd do pick and shovel work if the Vandermeers told him to. As for old Cool, just keep calling him Doctor instead of Mister, and let him talk about the virtues of progressive education for half an hour, and you'll have him eating out of your hand. But neither of those interviews was a success. Mr. Garrett, who didn't look even faintly capable of pick and shovel work as he sat behind the wide desk in his office, told her that the rent for the gatehouse would amount to more than she had ever paid for living quarters before. And that will include the utilities, will it? The heating and so on? No, it won't, Mrs. Prentice. Utilities are extra. I see. And she had nothing to say but I see to Dr. Eugene Poole a few days later, when he explained that Riverside Country Day would be unable to give Bobby a scholarship. The best that could be arranged was what he called a partial scholarship, and that meant she would pay almost as much as full tuition. Everything now depended on the income she hoped to earn in the squash court. But a surprising number of her students declined to transfer from the Arts and Crafts Guild. Some said Riverside was too far from home. Others said they couldn't afford the fees. In the end, she received commitments from only 8 students out of a possible 15. Well, that's a nucleus anyway, said Maud Larkin, without whom it would have been a nucleus of 7. We can recruit plenty of others from around here. Probably a lot more interesting students than that damn Scarsdale crowd anyway. Really, dear, I'm sure it'll work. It'll all work out once you get started. It'll all work out once you get settled. But Jim wasn't sure at all. How's she ever going to get settled with bills like that coming in? If I were you, Alice, I'd think twice before you take on any of this. You're much better off in Scarsdale. He didn't seem to understand that there was no turning back. The new life would be possible, in spite of everything. It had to be. Alice was committed to it now with a desperate optimism that left no room for argument. She had faith in the essential rightness of it. There was still the problem of making it all sound feasible to George. She had told him only that her work at the county center had led to the establishment of new private classes in a studio of her own, which might soon make her self-supporting, and that this would require their moving to Riverside, which she described only as quite a small, nice community with a fine school for Bobby. Now she had to confess that the rent would be much higher than in Scarsdale, and that the fine school was in fact not a public one. Soon he was exploding with questions on the phone. A private school? A private estate? What did she mean, private estate? Vandermeer? Walter J. Vandermeer? Good God, didn't she know those people were millionaires? And in the end, it was a deadlock. Alice, it sounds to me like you're biting off an awful lot more than you can chew. I don't like any part of this. I'm not asking you to like it. I'm not asking you to interfere in any of my affairs, and I certainly don't have to ask your approval. It's none of your business. And she gained courage after she'd hung up on him from the very firmness with which she'd made that final statement. It was none of his business. It was entirely her own, and Bobby's. If it wasn't the kind of venture George Prentice could understand, that only proved how incapable he was of understanding her at all. Nothing could stop her now. They made the move in September of 1937. They hung Sterling Nelson's Perdot over the fireplace and found attractive settings for Sterling Nelson's paintings and furniture. And soon their home was far more than rich and cozy. It was interesting, in a way none of their homes had been before. Maud and Jim Larkin came over to praise the house, bringing friends of theirs who praised it too. And it wasn't long before Bobby began bringing boys home from school. Boys whose manners were as cool and strange as the Larkins' children's, and whose parentage Maud was quick to endorse. The little Jennings boy? Oh, that's R. Philip Jennings. He's very big at time in life. Or the Ferguson boy? Oh, they're a marvelous family. Horace Ferguson was old Vandermeer's private secretary for years until he got to be a partner in the firm. Now he sort of tells Walter Jr. what to do. His wife's kind of a bore, but Horace is really sweet. Jim's quite fond of him, even though they argue politics all the time. And soon there were evenings in the homes of these people. Evenings in which she was instantly accepted at the Larkins as the Larkins' friend, Alice Prentice the sculptor. The men were flattering and solicitous, and the women expressed interest in becoming sculpture students. One of the first things she did was get a good supply of personal stationery printed up. Alice Prentice, Boxwood, Riverside, New York. And she wrote enthusiastic letters to everyone she knew who might be glad of her good fortune. Her New York friends, several people in Scarsdale, and all of her sisters. The longest and most enthusiastic letter was for Eva, Mrs. Owen Forbes of Austin, Texas, and Eva was quick to reply. I can't tell you how much I admire your spirit, dear. You are indomitable. I know it will be a wonderful new life for you and Bobby. Owen joins me in sending... The phrase, you are indomitable, occurred to her more than a few times during her long mornings in the squash court, for she was producing a good deal and working like a professional. Art did require a congenial environment. The squash court and the new life of Boxwood, with its aura of wealth and ease, seemed to have freed her talent from a kind of bondage. Ideas that had seemed intractable in her makeshift Scarsdale studios now proved capable of swift and competent fruition. Casts of some of her old garden figures were grouped in the far end of the studio, respectable relics of a period she had outgrown. But much of the experimental work she'd done in Scarsdale was now hidden from view under muslin cloths because it no longer pleased her. She had taken up a new medium, direct stone carving. It was a thing she had tried several times before in an amateurish way, but only now was she beginning to discover its potentialities. There was something more vital, more elemental about stone. It made modeling seem artificial. She didn't abandon clay. Some pieces had to be modeled, but in both media she was moving into a brave new freedom of expression. She felt she was approaching a mastery of sculpture for the first time in her life. Willard Slade would have been proud of her. Even her less successful efforts were promising. She was developing pieces worthy of submission to the Whitney Annual, as well as to other lesser exhibitions, and she felt that she might have enough finished work to warrant a one-man show in New York by spring. And the teaching, 3 afternoons a week, was anything but a conflict. She found it stimulating, and she moved among her students with a calm authority she had never been able to achieve in White Plains. All sculpture is a matter of form in relation to form, she would say, and coming to pause over someone's half-finished piece, she would find an example. Now, you see, this shape doesn't fully relate to this shape, not in a really dynamic way. Perhaps if this shape were made more forceful, if we could feel its thrust into this shape, we might find a more satisfying statement. Then, moving on, she would say, we have to develop a sense of mass in our work. We can never allow ourselves to look at the composition from a two-dimensional viewpoint. She had never known teaching could be such a pleasure, nor had she ever more consistently enjoyed the feeling that she was holding her students spellbound. Once, in the middle of a particularly full afternoon, she looked up from her criticism to find that Mrs. Vandermeer had come quietly through the tiny door and was observing the class. "Please don't let me interrupt you, Mrs. Prentice," she said. "I just wanted to come and watch." I must say it's most fascinating. By the beginning of the winter, she was running into debt. The class had gained only 3 new pupils, and the bills were mounting. But at Christmas time she received a formal note requesting the pleasure of her company at the home of Mrs. Walter J. Vandermeer, and an excited talk with Maud, who had also received one, confirmed that it was indeed a social triumph. Only a very few people were ever asked to the big house Christmas parties, and the rest of the town practically commits suicide every year. Maud and Alice bought new evening dresses for the occasion, and the occasion itself left nothing to be desired. Yuletide logs were ablaze in great fireplaces, making hundreds of tiny reflected fires in crystal and silver. White-coated servants carried trays of hot hors d'oeuvres and punch, and Mrs. Vandermeer moved slowly and regally among her guests. Jim Larkin looked crude and out of place in his tuxedo. He kept saying things like, "Where the hell's the food?" and "Why don't they put out any decent booze?" So Alice was glad that he and Maud weren't standing nearby when Mrs. Vandermeer came over to her and extended one elegant hand. "I've seen so little of you since you moved in, Mrs. Prentice," she said. "I hope everything's been satisfactory." "Oh yes, thank you. Everything's been fine." "Has the squash court been adequate for your purposes?" "Oh, much more than adequate. It's a wonderful studio." "I'm so glad. Have you met Dr. Hammond?" And there was a tall, emaciated, beautiful old man who turned out to be the rector of Trinity, the Riverside Episcopal Church. Mrs. Vandermeer drifted away, and Alice spent almost an hour talking with Dr. Hammond, aware from time to time that Mrs. Vandermeer was observing their conversation with approval. She found herself saying, "I've always been fascinated by the Episcopal service," which wasn't really a lie. Episcopalians had been the people she admired most in the town of her childhood, and more than a few times in recent years she had spent tearful Sunday mornings in the dark, cool nave of St. Luke's in New York. And before he cordially withdrew, she had promised to become a member of his parish. "I saw you were really hitting it off with old Hammond," Maud said on their way home. "That's playing your cards right. He and the old lady are thick as thieves. She calls him her spiritual adviser. If they both weren't so ancient, I think the whole town would suspect the worst." "He seemed very kind," Alice said with some severity, and she didn't care if Maud laughed or not. It was one of the first times, there would be others later, when she had reason to wonder if Maud might in some ways be a trivial person. From then on, she and Bobby never missed a Sunday at Trinity. Mrs. Vandermeer was always there in her private pew near the front, sometimes with Walter Jr. and his wife, and sometimes alone. Alice and Bobby would make their way down the aisle to take their places at a respectful distance, under the red and purple stained glass windows and the heavy tones of the organ. Dr. Hammond made a slow pageantry of the service. She found it hard to follow his sermons. She would allow her attention to wander to the shapes and colors of the altar, the windows, the choir loft, and sometimes she would plan pieces of ecclesiastical sculpture in her mind. But she joined wholeheartedly in the psalms and hymns, and certain of the ritual prayers intoned in Dr. Hammond's deep and melodious voice would always make her weep. "O God, who hast prepared for those who love thee such good things as pass man's understanding, pour into our hearts such love toward thee, that we, loving thee above all things, may obtain thy promises, which exceed all that we can desire." When the recessional was over and Dr. Hammond stood in the sunshine of the front door, shaking hands, she would say, "That was wonderful, Doctor. Thank you so much." If she happened to catch Mrs. Vandermeer's eye among the departing parishioners, she would nod and smile with dignity, and Mrs. Vandermeer would always return the greeting. She enrolled Bobby in the confirmation class, which was conducted by Walter Jr.'s wife, and the most memorable, most ennobling Sunday of her spring was when she watched Bobby kneel at the rail to take his first communion, having received the laying on of hands from no less a personage than Bishop Manning of New York. Soon after that, Soon after that, she learned that one of Dr. Hammond's altar boys had dropped out, and she arranged to have Bobby fill the vacancy. He became the crucifier. Erect and solemn in a flowing white surplice bearing the long shaft of the bronze cross, he would lead the singing choristers in from the vestry at the beginning of each service, and lead them out again at the end, while Dr. Hammond reverently brought up the rear. It was a spectacle that never failed to fill her with pride and hope. Nothing, not even the pleasure of her days in the squash court, gave her a greater sense of being exactly where she belonged. In June, she was summoned to Walter Jr.'s office for what he called a talk about your plans for the future. I mean, he said uneasily, do you plan to stay here indefinitely? Yes, I do. My work in the studio hasn't been as profitable as I'd hoped, but I'm confident it will be soon. I see. Well, I don't mean to press you, but quite naturally we've been concerned. For one thing, there's the matter of your rent, which Mr. Garrett tells me is 3 months in arrears, and quite naturally, for another thing, there was the matter of Bobby's tuition, also in arrears, and that led to another small ordeal in the office of Dr. Eugene Cool. Well, but the point is, Doctor, I was rather hoping I wondered if we might discuss the possibility of his receiving a full scholarship next year. I see. Suppose we take a look at his. Dr. Cool fingered through a drawer in a filing cabinet and produced a manila folder, which he opened and spread before him as he fixed his tortoise-shell glasses into position. The record disclosed that Robert Prentice's intelligence quotient had been assessed at slightly above average, and that he had done reasonably well in the fields of social adjustment and personality growth. But his capacity for self-discipline had received the rating of poor, and of the 6 units of study assigned to him during the academic year, he had failed 2. Had received the grade of incomplete in 1 and the passing grade of C in the other 3. There was also a brief note by one of his teachers under the heading of Remarks, which Dr. Cool chose to read aloud. Robert may eventually turn out to be as precocious as he seems to think he is, but if he expects to prove it to me, he will have to buckle down. So you see, Mrs. Prentice, he said, closing the folder and removing his glasses, under the circumstances, any question of extending his scholarship is really quite out of the question. Both interviews were upsetting, and she went to the Larkins' house for cocktails and sympathy, dimly hoping that the Larkins might help her find a way out of the problem. But she found them both surprised to learn how bad things were. Maud had apparently assumed that the sculpture classes were paying for everything, and Jim, having warned her against Riverside in the first place, had apparently given it no further thought. Well, but even so, Maud said, it does seem outrageous that they should be dunning you. Don't you think so, Jim? Jim Larkin was laboriously lighting a cigar. He had explained when Alice came in that he was feeling lousy because he'd been up working all night. And now, unshaven and wearing a sweatshirt, he looked irritable. I don't see what's so outrageous about it, he said. She does owe the money, after all. But Jim, it isn't fair. Alice is an asset to this place, and they ought to realize it. They ought to be proud to have her there, proud to have her here. Well, I agree, he said. I agree 100%. Trouble is, the bills still have to be paid. You're the same as anywhere else. Guess I can't expect you to see that because you never earned $1 in your life. But if you had my headaches, you'd see it fast enough. You'll have to excuse my wife, Alice. I guess I've spoiled her. She doesn't quite understand the facts of life. And he reached over to pour a martini into Alice's glass. So they're kind of ganging up on you, are they? Isn't there some way you can raise a little dough? Staring down into her bright drink, Alice mulled over a thought that had often occurred to her before. Why couldn't Jim Larkin himself, with his embarrassment of riches from radio, why couldn't he lend her money? Alice, there is a way, Maud said, and Alice hoped she would say, we'll help you. But instead she said, by selling some of your work, I don't mean the things you're doing now, those are museum pieces, but some of your garden things, the fawn, the pan, the goose girl, all those things are lovely in their way. And is there any reason why the Vandermeers shouldn't be prime customers? Have you ever noticed how many little dells and glades in boxwood are crying out for garden sculpture? Sounds great, Jim said. Personally, though, if I were old Walter Jr., I don't think I'd really be in the market for any pans or goose girls right now. And Alice knew he was probably right. This was clearly the time to come right out and ask him for a loan. She would never have a better opportunity. But if words existed for the making of such a request, they had eluded her. All she could do was sit here and drink the Larkins' gin, beginning to dislike them both. In the end, as usual, she got the money from George, enough to settle the rent bill and the fuel oil bill and to make a token payment on the tuition. But he warned her that this was absolutely the last time he could so exceed the divorce agreement. Alice, I just don't see where this is going to end. My only advice to you now is that you better get out of that place before they throw you out. No one's going to throw me out, George. Why not? You go on running up these impossible debts and they'll sue you. They can do that, you know. They can sue you and attach your income. George, I know you've never understood this, but I know what I'm doing. Next year is going to be entirely different. My classes are bound to expand, for one thing, and I happen to be doing a great deal of very good, very important work that's bound to be profitable. I know these problems won't go on much longer. They'd better not. They can't. For the rest of the summer, she managed to pay the rent, which gave her an illusion of solvency until the beginning of the school year. After that, the illusion was harder to sustain, but she hoped the tuition question wouldn't come to a crisis until February. And that seemed comfortably far away. She gained no new students in the fall, but her own work was going so well as to promise great things. She had visions of a one-man show in the spring that might rescue her financially and make her famous at the same time. Even on bad days, she was comforted by faith. God, as invoked by Dr. Hammond's rich voice every Sunday, would not fail to provide for her. Maud's enthusiasm was waning. I don't know what to suggest here. I honestly don't know what I'd do if I were you. And Jim was by now openly advocating that she leave town. You can't fight arithmetic, Alice, he said. I feel Maud and I more or less got you into this mess, and I'm sorry for that. But it does seem only sensible for you to get out while the getting's good. By saying that, he made it harder than ever for her to ask him for money, and she hated him for it. The only person who seemed to understand her, however distantly, was Eva, and she began to draw strength from the phrasing of Eva's letters. If you believe that what you are doing is right, then stick to it. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. That's always been your way, and the way of all brave and forthright people. And please remember, dear, that Owen and I stand ready to offer you whatever help we can. Financial help is impossible, I'm afraid, but in a real emergency, we can always offer you and Bobby a temporary home. By December, she was 3 months in arrears with the rent again, and she owed a terrible amount of money to the oil dealer. Let's not answer the doorbell, Bobby, she would say when they saw Mr. Garrett's car in the driveway, or the car of the man who collected for the oil company. And they would hide like thieves until the car went away. Bobby was a willing accomplice. He was doing as badly in school as she was in her financial affairs. And with a 12-year-old sense of justice, he seemed to feel it appropriate that they should be both fugitives from authority, threatened with expulsion. I don't care if we have to leave, he told her. Well, she said, we don't have to leave yet. Shortly before Christmas, there was another, more unpleasant interview in Walter Jr.'s office. We have to expect you to fulfill your agreements, Mrs. Prentice, he said. This kind of thing really can't go on. I feel it's only fair to warn you that we may be obliged to take legal action. And he evidently told his mother how matters stood, for the old lady became noticeably cool toward Alice at church, and did not invite her, this was a terrible blow, to the annual Christmas party. In January, she imposed on one of the Larkins' friends, a photographer, to take dramatically lighted pictures of some of her best new work, and she took the photographs to New York to make the rounds at the 57th Street galleries. It was a project that consumed 4 days and yielded no tangible results. One gallery manager asked her to leave her name, but that was all. Then one sleeting afternoon, after she and Bobby had managed to avoid a visit from Mr. Garrett, a desperate final measure occurred to her. They could sell some of Sterling Nelson's things. From the Manhattan telephone book, she found an antique dealer and an art appraiser, and she arranged for them to come out to Riverside on 2 successive days. The antique dealer came first, a heavy young man with a simpering manner. He pronounced some of the furniture interesting, but not in good enough condition. If we were in town, I'd offer you $100 for the lot and take my chances, but out here it's impractical. I'd spend very nearly that much just to move it. And what about the Prada? I don't know what I'd do with something like that. It's an unusual curio, but I don't know where I'd find a market for it. And the art appraiser was even worse. An old man blotting his leaking nose with a dirty handkerchief. He scrutinized the Murillo, and the Poussin, and all the other dark, heavy paintings, and said they were fakes. Not even very skillful fakes. And so Sterling Nelson had come back over the years to deceive and desert her again. The end came early in March, not with a final visit from Mr. Garrett or an ultimatum from Dr. Cool, or harsh words in Walter Jr.'s office, but with the dizzying suddenness of matters gone wholly out of control. A man appeared at the door one day, identified himself as a deputy sheriff, and handed her a document with the heading, "Original Notice of Action Pending Against You in the Supreme Court of Westchester County." She had never been sued before and had no idea of what to do. Her first impulse was to call George, but instead she fled to the Larkins' house. The Larkins' daughter answered the door eating an apple. "Is your father home?" "Well, yes, Mrs. Prentice, but he's working." "Is your mother home?" "Yes, but she's resting." "Oh, please." The girl looked startled and backed away, apple juice shining on her lips. "I'm sorry, but this is terribly important," Alice said. "I've got to see them, please." "Well, I don't know what to..." But then Jim Larkin emerged blinking from his study wearing his sweatshirt. And she turned on him. "You!" She hadn't planned this burst of anger, but she couldn't control herself. "You could have helped me. You could have helped me months ago. You could have helped me months and months ago, and now it's too late. Look at this. Look at this." He took the document, put on his glasses, and frowned over it. "It's too late," she cried. "Oh, it's too late. It's too late." Maud came hurrying downstairs in a housecoat with her hair in curlers. "Alice," she said, "what's the... You, my friend. Ha. Oh, you've been a fine friend to me, haven't you?" In the silence that followed, while Jim handed the paper to Maud, there was a crisp, moist chomping sound. The girl had taken another bite of her apple. Alice sat down on the sofa and covered her face with her hands. "Oh, God," she said. Oh, God." "Alice," Jim Larkin said, "I really don't see why you're attacking us about this. Frankly, I think you're way out of line." "Oh, God." "Well, but what can she do, Jim?" Maud inquired. "Looks to me like the best thing to do is disappear," Jim said. "I imagine that's all the Vandermeers really want, anyway. They must know they can't collect. Isn't there somewhere you can go, Alice? Somewhere out of the state? Somewhere good and far away?" And the only place she could think of in all the world was Austin, Texas.